Okay, we're going to try the lesson this week is Paul's last days or final days. So what we did 3 weeks ago, we looked at Paul's conversion and his first two missionary journeys. What I hope to do today is to take you through his third missionary journey to his death. And that's the goal. So there's always a lot of stuff to talk about. Now, we looked at that. Paul's second missionary journey, we looked at from his conversion to the end of his second missionary journey. That's the period from about AD 33 to AD 51, 52, so roughly 18 years. And before Paul was brought to Antioch by Barnabas, which was in 45 or 46, he had spent, maybe I'll throw up the map of his first journey, he had spent 8 to 10 years in Tarsus of Cilicia. If you remember, he'd been sent there after he'd gone to Jerusalem. And so to keep him from getting killed, the brothers sent him to Tarsus of Cilicia. So he was there for 8 or 10 years. And then Barnabas calls him over to Antioch in 45 or 46. And we're not sure what all, certainly Paul was preaching and teaching in Tarsus of Cilicia. But we really don't have any details about his life during that time. Now, here's his first missionary journey we talked about 3 weeks ago. I just put that up there to remind you. That was his first missionary journey. And you will recall, at least I hope, that on his second missionary journey, here's the second missionary journey, Paul stayed in Corinth over a year and a half. So he comes down, he winds up over here in Corinth. He stays there over a year and a half, and that's when he writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, back to the church up here that he'd founded in Thessalonica. So Paul does this here on his second missionary journey. And when he headed back to Antioch, you remember he met Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth, who had been sent there after the Jews had been expelled from Rome under Emperor Claudius. So he meets Priscilla and Aquila there, and then as he heads back to Antioch, back to the church there, Priscilla and Aquila accompany him, and Paul leaves them in Ephesus. And then Paul sails on to Caesarea. He then goes up and he greets the church in Jerusalem, and then he returns to Antioch. And this is probably 51 or 52 when this is happening. And it's not long before long after that Paul heads out on his third missionary journey. Now, I still have here the second missionary. All right. After Paul left Ephesus, he sails there. Priscilla and Aquila accompany him to Ephesus. He leaves them there. After Paul left Ephesus, that's when Apollos arrived in Ephesus, knowing only the baptism of John, and that's when Priscilla and Aquila explained to him the way of God more accurately. And then Apollos went to Corinth. Remember, Paul's planted the church in Corinth. Paul takes Priscilla and Aquila to Ephesus. Paul leaves them there. Apollos goes to Ephesus. Priscilla and Aquila teach Apollos the way of God more accurately. And then Apollos, he goes to Corinth with a letter of recommendation from the brothers in Ephesus. And you can see that in Acts 18:24 through 19:1. Now, Apollos and others, probably including the Apostle Peter at some point, they built on the foundation that Paul had laid for the church there in Corinth. Now, in AD 52, so Paul, at the end of the second missionary journey, goes up and visits the church in Jerusalem, goes back to Antioch, and it's not long after that he begins his third missionary journey, which is probably in AD 52. And Paul goes through the inland area, but we're not really told a lot about that. He goes through here, and he's no doubt visiting these churches and speaking with them, but he arrives in Ephesus. Paul arrives back there in Ephesus, and he begins this journey in 52. Probably the summer or the fall of 52, he's back in Ephesus, and he had a very fruitful ministry in the city of Ephesus. And he stayed in Ephesus for more than 2.5 years. And while he's there, while Paul's in Ephesus during this more than 2.5 year period of time, Paul learns of certain problems with the church in Corinth. So we're not told who tells him this, but Paul learns of certain problems of the church in Corinth, and he wrote a letter to the church in Corinth. Now, this letter is referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. He hears of problems. He writes a letter to the church there, and he forbids them from associating with immoral people. Now, this is a letter that's referred to, as I say, in 1 Corinthians 5, 9. Now, that letter's not been preserved. We don't have that letter. That doesn't mean that letter is missing. We don't have that letter because God didn't intend it for us to have that letter. So at first, he writes to them, tells them not to associate with immoral people. He refers to that earlier letter when he writes 1 Corinthians. Now, at some point during this more than 2.5 years that Paul is in Ephesus, during his Ephesian ministry, Paul also receives reports from some in Chloe's household, as he says in 1 Corinthians 1:11, about the ugly factionalism in Corinth. So he receives reports from some in Chloe's household, and it may have been at that time that Paul then from Ephesus, after hearing that report, he dispatches Timothy to Corinth. And you see that referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. Well, also when he's in Ephesus, there are 3 church delegates from the church in Corinth who come to see Paul in Ephesus bearing a letter from the church in Corinth. And so Paul has information about what's going on there from that letter, but also from the verbal reports of those 3 delegates, Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus. So he has that. They tell him, they fill him in. They're going to say, here's the situation, and here's what's going on. And all of that information established Paul's agenda as he wrote 1 Corinthians. Now that's probably in AD 54 or 55. And it's unclear whether Timothy arrived. Timothy probably is not carrying 1 Corinthians. But Paul had dispatched Timothy to Corinth, and it's unclear whether Timothy arrived before or after the letter of 1 Corinthians arrives there. Now we see from 1 Corinthians, you know the story. I mean, you know from 1 Corinthians what's going on. This spiritually immature church, you have that they had formed partisan groupings that claimed to follow, this or that leader. You remember the mention of Apollos? Well, they'd sent Apollos over there. They formed these partisan groupings. In addition, the church was marred by abuses of the Lord's Supper, by immorality, by lawsuits, by uncertainties about the place of marriage and the propriety of eating food sacrificed to idols. They had a warped view of charismatic gifts. They had a spiritualized view of the resurrection. And segments of the church were disenchanted with Paul. And they were resistant to Paul's leadership. And you see that, and I think about Paul, what he went through. Ministry is just tough. And so here their folks are disenchanted, and you see that pop up a number of places. Now, when Paul sent 1 Corinthians, you wonder why I'm telling you all this, but you'll see he spends time talking about it. When Paul sent 1 Corinthians, it was his intent, he says, to remain in Ephesus until Pentecost, which is in late May, and he's probably meaning of the year 55. So when he sends 1 Corinthians, he's planning to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost, late May of 55, and then he says it's his intent to visit them by way of Macedonia. So Paul is in Ephesus. He's going to visit the Corinthians this way. That was his intent when he wrote 1 Corinthians, and you see that in 1 Corinthians 16, 5 through 8. That would put Paul in Corinth sometime in the winter of that year, as you see in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 6. Well, when he formulated those plans, Paul didn't have any sense of urgency about going to Corinth. After all, he was in no hurry to leave Ephesus, because the great door for effective work that he mentions in Ephesus, that door was still open there. So he had no great urgency. But after sending 1 Corinthians, Paul then decided that it would be better to visit the Corinthians on his way here and on his way back. So instead of this. So he plans he's going to visit them twice. He decides that after he sent 1 Corinthians. And he then learns, perhaps when Timothy returned, you remember that he had dispatched Timothy to Corinth. He'd also sent 1 Corinthians. He then learns, perhaps when Timothy returned, that conditions at the church in Corinth had become critical. Okay, something had happened that things were absolutely critical, due in part to the arrival in Corinth of certain Judaizing intruders from Palestine who presented themselves as leaders. So they're saying, we're the real voice in Christianity. And they're Judaizing intruders, and you see that in 2 Corinthians 11:4, 11:13 to 15, 11:22. So this prompted Paul to make an emergency visit to Corinth. He makes an emergency visit where he's going to go, but now because of this situation, he has to go immediately. And though he seems to have spared the rod that he had mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 4:21, the visit that he made then, that emergency visit, was painful. And it was painful for the Corinthians and for Paul. You see in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. And for whatever reason, see, you can tell I'm putting a lot of things together here. But for whatever reason, see, Paul found it necessary to leave the situation in Corinth, that he'd gone there on this emergency visit because things had gotten so bad. He found it necessary to leave that situation unresolved and return to Ephesus. Now, we're not told what all is going on and why that happens. You say, well, who knows what happens in Ephesus? I know there's going to be a riot there. You see, so you don't know. But Paul makes this emergency visit. He leaves that situation unresolved. He returns to Ephesus. And at some point, one of Paul's opponents in Corinth defied him openly and attacked him in personal and deeply insulting ways. And the church in Corinth apparently accepted it. They tolerated that what was being done. You see in 2 Corinthians 2, 5 to 8, 2 Corinthians 2, 10, 2 Corinthians 7, 12. So somebody has insulted Paul and attacked him in personal and deeply insulting ways. Now this probably occurred, there's different views on this, but this probably occurred right after Paul left Corinth back to Ephesus after he's made this emergency visit. And then Paul is told about what this person said about him in the church, and the church tolerated it. Okay, so this has gone on. Now, Paul, presumably, when Paul made that emergency visit, he told the Corinthians early on, right when he got there, before he saw how that emergency visit was going to play out. Presumably, he told them about his new plans, that he was going to, instead of what he had said when he wrote 1 Corinthians, visiting this way, he's now planning to visit them this way. So he presumably told them that at the beginning of that. But the emergency visit, it turned out to be such a distressing and an unproductive clash that was not resolved, and then he had to return back to Ephesus for some reason. That visit turned out to be so distressing and so unproductive that Paul said he figured it would be better to delay his next visit until after his trip to Macedonia. So in other words, Paul, after that emergency visit, seems to have reverted to the original itinerary. Okay, because that was distressing and unproductive. He says, I'll go to Macedonia and I'll work, and it'll be a longer time before I do that. So Paul does that. He winds up changing that itinerary, reverting to the original itinerary. Now, as Luke notes in Acts chapter 19, verse 21, Paul's longer range plan, of course, is to go to Jerusalem after Corinth and then to Rome. This is what Paul is planning to do. He's ultimately going to make it. All right, well, after returning to Ephesus, after this painful emergency visit that Paul makes, and being informed of this personal and deeply insulting attack that had been made on him and had been tolerated by the church in Corinth, Paul then sends Titus to the Corinthians with the severe letter. The severe letter that's referred to in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, and 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 8 through 12. It is a letter that Paul says he wrote out of much affliction and anguish of heart and with many tears. He sends Titus with that severe letter, And Paul assured the Corinthians in that letter of his love for them, but he laid down the standards that he expected the church in the churches, and he sought to determine whether they would meet those standards. You see that in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9. So this is this severe letter that he sends, and he also demanded punishment of the person who had opposed him so maliciously. This is not just about Paul's, being insulted. This is about Paul's function as an apostle. You see, it's not just about Paul, it's about Paul having a larger role for the blessing of the church. And so he demanded that this person be dealt with, this person who had insulted him so maliciously. You see that in 2 Corinthians 2, 3 through 9, and 7, 8 through 12. Now that letter, that severe letter that Paul sent by Titus, also has not been preserved. So we have an initial letter that's not preserved. We have 1 Corinthians. We have a severe letter that's not preserved, and then we'll have 2 Corinthians. Okay, so that's just important to know. Now Titus, when Titus delivers the severe letter to the Corinthians, he presumably let it be known that he had plans to meet up with Paul in Troas or in Macedonia. They apparently had a fallback plan, that if you don't get to Troas by such and such a time, then we'll hook up in Macedonia. So he apparently let the Corinthians know that he had plans to meet Paul in Troas or Macedonia with news of their response to this severe letter, which then told the Corinthians that Paul had changed his plan to visit them this way. He first wrote them and said, I'm coming this way. He then comes and lets them know, no, I'm going to do this. Well, now they know that he's going to do this. And see, so this opened Paul to the charge of being fickle, being untrustworthy, and being indifferent to the feelings of the church in Corinth, which leads him to explain his change of plans in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 22 through chapter 2, verse 2. That's why all that stuff in there. When Paul's talking about his change of plans, what has happened? He's had to change his plans for ministerial reasons, and they're using it to say that Paul's fickle. He's unreliable. The guy blows with the wind. He says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this. And they were trying to use it. The opponents in there are trying to use this against Paul. So Paul in 2 Corinthians in the early chapters explains that change of plans. Now Titus also, Paul sends Titus with this severe letter, and Titus also had the responsibility, depending on how the Corinthians responded to this severe letter, he had the responsibility to organize the collection for Jerusalem. You see that in 2 Corinthians 8:6, to which the Corinthians, they had originally been willing to contribute. Well, now it's kind of up in the air. They're going to go through with this. There's an awful lot of hostility and tension going on. He sends Titus with this severe letter, and if they blow up in terms of severe letter, then they probably aren't going to contribute. But if not, so he has the responsibility, depending how they react to that severe letter, of organizing the collection. And their participation in that collection would not only bless the poor in Jerusalem, but it would signal their fellowship with Paul and with the apostolic church. Now, intending to visit Corinth by way of Macedonia, this is now his plan. He had reverted to the initial itinerary, and ultimately to go on to Jerusalem. Paul then sent Timothy and Erastus. He sent them into Macedonia ahead of him. You see that in Acts 19:22. And not long after doing that, that's when the riot breaks out. He sends them to Macedonia ahead of him. He's planning to go that way. But then we have the riot that breaks out in Ephesus, having been instigated by the silversmith Demetrius, who made the silver shrines of the goddess Artemis. And so he says, hey, this guy's interfering with our business, and there's this big, huge riot that goes on there. And then Paul promptly then, with that riot, he leaves and he goes to Troas. So Paul then, he goes to Troas. It says where he had hoped not only to preach the gospel, but to meet Titus, returning with news of the Corinthian reaction to the severe letter. Paul's interested. He wants to know. How did they receive this letter? You see that in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 12. And when Titus didn't show in Troas, Paul then went into Macedonia, 2 Corinthians 2:13, and that's, of course, where the cities of Philippi, Thessalonica, he went into that region, apparently in keeping with a contingency plan that he had with Titus. It had to be, see, when you don't have communication, it has to be, if you don't get here, if you can't make it here by this date, I will be there for you, and that's where we'll meet. But if you can't make it there by that date, then we're going to hook up in Macedonia. So they apparently had some kind of contingency travel plans. And Paul in Macedonia, we see in Acts 20 that he encouraged the saints there, and he organized the collection that Paul's taking up from the Gentiles for the poor Jewish Christians in Judea. This is important. Paul is organizing this collection. You see that in 2 Corinthians 8, 1-4, 2 Corinthians 9, 2. So you see the Macedonian churches, he's there in Macedonia now, and he's organizing this collection from the Gentiles for the poor Jewish Christians in Judea. And the Macedonian churches were facing, he says, the most severe trial and extreme poverty. He says that in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 2. And yet they insisted on what? They insisted on participating in that contribution. It wasn't like, in churches where you got to go and beg people and urge. They heard that they're giving money to the poor saint. I'm in. You can't stop me from giving it. I want to be part of that, and I want to give. So they insisted on doing it, and they gave, as you know, 2 Corinthians 8, 1-5, with extreme generosity. So this is the Macedonian church now. When Paul got to Macedonia, Titus had not shown up, so Paul still had no idea of how they had reacted to this severe letter that he had sent by Titus. You see that in 2 Corinthians 7, 5, and 6. Titus soon arrives to Paul in Macedonia from Corinth, having delivered the severe letter. He soon arrives, and Paul's distress then turns to joy, because the church at large, the church in Corinth, had by and large responded positively to Paul's very strong words. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 6-13. The majority had repented of their rebellion and their resistance to Paul's leadership. They had changed from that. Now, there was a segment, however, that continued to resist Paul's authority and Paul's gospel, and 2 Corinthians is shaped by the presence of both of those groups in Corinth. Now, there was still continued to be a group there that was like that, but by and large, the church had responded very positively to Paul's severe letter. Now, Paul probably started writing 2 Corinthians right after receiving the news from Titus, this encouraging report, but it seems likely that Paul received more bad news from the church, about the church in Corinth, before he finished writing 2 Corinthians. I don't know if you've done much writing, but oftentimes writing takes a while. You see, you start something, and you've read 2 Corinthians is a decent-sized letter. So you say, well, I want to, here, say this, and then I'm going to say this, and this, and this, and this. So somewhere it looks like, now this is supposition, but it makes a lot of sense. If you read 2 Corinthians, it looks like between chapter 9 and chapter 10 that Paul has now received more news from Corinth, and it's discouraging. There's a change of tone in chapters 10 through 13 that suggests that Paul had received news of some kind of counteroffensive that had been launched against him by the Judaizing intruders. So he had sent the severe letter by Titus. It had been positively received and had a really positive impact, but that segment that was still not sold, especially these Judaizing intruders from Palestine who were claiming to be leaders, they were stirring up a counteroffensive. And it looks like that news of their success in that regard reached Paul right when he's writing chapter 10. Now, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say as he begins chapter 10, by the way, I've heard more news, but that would have been obvious to the Corinthians because, by the specific references to the new charges he refers to. You see, so the references to the new charges, they would know what that was in 2 Corinthians 10. Now, this is probably sometime in AD 56 that he writes 2 Corinthians from Macedonia down to the church there. Paul then works his way down from Macedonia down to Greece, and he stays there he spends 3 months there. We see in Acts chapter 20, verse 3, no doubt in Corinth. So he spends 3 months in Corinth, and this is AD 57 probably, and this is when he writes Romans. Paul writes Romans from Corinth to the church there in Rome, and we recently went through the book of Romans, or the letter. Paul then accompanied by Timothy and some others. Paul is accompanied, he's down here, he spends 3 months in Corinth. He writes Romans. And then accompanied by Timothy and some others, Paul headed back through Macedonia. He was planning to sail, but this is when the Jews made a plot. He's about to sail to Syria, and the Jews made a plot against him, so he changed, and he went back up through Macedonia. Well, Timothy and some others and Paul head back through Macedonia, but Timothy and some others, they headed to Troas. They went ahead to Troas, where Paul and Luke joined them in Troas, Paul and Luke sailing to Troas from Philippi. And so Timothy and some others go there. Paul and Luke join them there, sailing there from Philippi. And then the whole group leaves Troas immediately after the Lord's Day because they were in a hurry to get to Jerusalem. And this is very interesting, significant also. You remember that they're there, they're in a hurry to go, but they wait until the Lord's Day. You see, and as soon as the Lord's Day is over, they depart. Now, Paul, he hoofs it. Paul departs. He goes from Troas, he hoofs down to Assos, down here. Well, he's then picked up by boat. So they leave Troas, and those who sailed from Troas then stopped by and picked Paul up at Assos, where he had hoofed down there, and then they continued on to Jerusalem. And you see that in Acts chapter 20, verses 13 and 14. So they pick up Paul, and now they're going to continue on here to Jerusalem. This is Paul here at the end of his third journey. The ship, on the way to Jerusalem, the ship stops at Miletus. Well, this is where Paul sends for the Ephesian elders. Right? Paul had spent a long time there. He'd spent, over 2.5 years there. And he sends for the Ephesian elders, and Paul prophesied in Acts chapter 20 that savage wolves would come in among the Ephesian Christians and wouldn't spare the flock. And this got to break Paul's heart. He's labored, he's been teaching. Anybody who's taught and tried to instill in people a devotion to Christ, you will inevitably have your heart broken, because people who say Jesus is Lord will oftentimes act like he is not. Now, that's how it is. Okay? It is a joy when they are faithful, and it is a killer when they're not. And so Paul here, when he's telling them this, he prophesies that, and Paul says, even from your own number, he's speaking to the Ephesian elders, even from your own number, men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw away disciples after them, so be on your guard. Remember that for 3 years, I never stopped warning each of you night and day with tears. That's Acts chapter 20, 29, and 30. And Paul also said that the elders would not see him again. So this is at Miletus on his way back to Jerusalem. And then with a few more stops, Paul makes it back to Jerusalem. And this is probably AD 57 that he arrives there. And he brought to Jerusalem this collection, this pocket of money, that he's gathered from the Gentile churches for the poor Jewish Christians in Judea. He's been going around to the Macedonian churches and all the Gentile churches. We're taking up a collection. We're taking up a collection, as we do sometimes, for projects. And so the Gentile churches had contributed, and this collection, as I've said before, it not only was an act of benevolence, it was that for sure, but it not only was an act of benevolence, it was a theological statement that the Jewish and the Gentile churches were one. See, that's why Paul indicates in Romans 15:31. You remember he writes Romans right down here in Corinth near the end of his third missionary journey, AD 57. That's why he says in Romans chapter 15:31 that he was concerned about how the gift would be received. You're thinking, what are you talking about? It's a gift. Give me the money. No, it wasn't all that clear because of all the theological overtones about the unity of the Jewish and Gentile churches. He was concerned about how that gift would be received. He was concerned that some may resist the unity that the acceptance of that gift would symbolize. You see, if I say, well, okay, thank you, brothers. Thank you for helping us, your brothers. Okay, well, that would symbolize a unity, and Paul was concerned that some might not accept it for that reason. Paul arrives, he's got the collection from the Gentile churches, and about a week after his arrival, he triggers a riot in the temple. I mean, Paul's life was something. I've often said, if Hollywood didn't hate God so much and cared about doing something, I assume they like money, they ought to make a movie about Paul's life. And I don't mean a movie that tries to turn Paul into, some gross sinner and all this kind of stuff where they can try to deny Christianity. I'm talking about a faithful movie of Paul's life that's done with skill and professionalism. I'm telling you, I could tell them, you don't have to be a prophet to see that movie would clean up. Okay? But you can't get Hollywood to listen. If ever they want to touch on something like that, they want to say, okay, how can we make Paul into something he's not? Okay, that's a footnote. All right, so Paul here, there's a riot that is triggered there in the temple. It's because some Jews thought that Paul had defiled the temple by bringing into the place of the temple that's for Jews only a Gentile named Trophimus. So this was their idea. It was false, but they had this idea, and so a riot breaks out, and there's a mob that dragged Paul from the temple and began beating Paul with the intent to kill him. And we're not just not messing with him. They're beating Paul with the intent to kill him. Paul was then arrested, and there's some interesting language there when they're arrested. Actually, when they send the letter, they arrest him, and they say, we had learned this guy, and we're actually arresting him. That's not what they were doing. But anyway, they take Paul, they arrest Paul after this, and he gets thrown in the slammer. And then this plot to kill him is uncovered. You remember his relative lets him know? And so Paul goes and says, hey, they're planning to kill me. And so that was uncovered. Paul was then transferred to the prison in Caesarea. So from Jerusalem, he goes up here to Caesarea. You see, this was the governing headquarters where the Roman procurator would typically hang out, the Roman governing authority. They'd come to Jerusalem for times like the festival when it would be, huge crowds. They'd keep an eye on everything. But they generally hung out by the coast, you see. And so that's where they was. So they take Paul there, and he's put in prison there and transferred there. And he was kept in prison in Caesarea for 2 years on these bogus charges. And when Governor Felix's successor, Festus, when he wanted to do a favor for the Jews, he asked Paul, he said, hey, we're up in Caesarea now. Would you mind going down and standing trial in Jerusalem? Well, Paul smells a rat. You see, Paul smells a conspiracy that what this really is about, they're going to kill him on the way to Jerusalem. So that's when Paul says, look, I'm standing before the court here, man. You got no right to hand me over to anybody. I appeal to Caesar. And so that's what happens. Paul then appeals to Caesar there, and that led to his being sent to Rome, now which is an interesting thing. God had told Paul before that he's going to Rome. And what is interesting to me is, you could go off on this, but here's Paul. You say, well, why don't you just transport me there? No, Paul, you're going to Rome, but by the way, your route to Rome is going to include beatings, imprisonment. You're going to spend 4 years in jail, and finally you're going to appeal to Caesar, and you're going to go, and by the way, there's going to be a shipwreck on the way there. You say, well, God, you told me I'm going to Rome. He said, I told you you're going to Rome, but you're going to Rome as, you're just going to have to trust me. You see, you're going to have to trust. And see, this is how life is. As John and I joke, this life isn't turning out like I planned. You see, there are just things that happen in this thing. So yet God said, you're going to Rome. He took him to Rome. But we say, God, why don't you just, transport me there? Could God do that? Sure, he could do it. But God's doing something else. He's doing something else. So Paul then appeals. This leads to Paul's being, he winds up going to Rome. And Paul spends another 2 years in Rome under house arrest. So he's thrown in prison there in Caesarea, 2 years. Okay, he was in jail. He was in jail for a while in Jerusalem, not long. Transferred 2 years there. I don't know if I said 4 years before. He's 2 years and then the shipwreck, and then he does 2 more years under house arrest in Rome. So a total of 4 years, but not 4 years before he travels. Now, while Paul's imprisoned in Rome, this is when the Philippians, you know that church in the Macedonian region, Philippi, this is when the Philippians send Epaphroditus to Paul with a gift. You see that in Philippians 4:18, and with instructions that Epaphroditus is to care for Paul's needs in Philippians chapter 2, verse 25. You see, Paul is under house arrest in Rome. So he has some freedom and some flexibility here. And so the Philippians send Epaphroditus with a gift and with instructions to care for Paul. And this is also the time when Philemon's runaway slave, Onesimus, encountered Paul and was converted. While Paul is under house arrest during these 2 years, probably 60, 62, during those 2 years in Rome. And it was during his confinement in Rome that Paul wrote Ephesians. He writes Ephesians then, which was probably a circular letter, by the way, to the churches in Asia Minor, that because of some contact with Ephesus, perhaps Ephesus was the initial point from which the letter circulated, it came at a very early date to be associated exclusively with the city of Ephesus. But it was probably a circular letter to the churches there. Well, it's also, so Paul writes Ephesus there, Epaphroditus visits him. This is where Onesimus encounters him and is converted. This is where Paul writes Ephesians. This is where Paul writes Philippians. This is where Paul writes Colossians. And this is where Paul writes Philemon. Remember where he sends Onesimus back? Okay, that's why those 4 letters are known collectively as the prison epistles. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. Because they're written by Paul during this Roman imprisonment. Now, Acts ends with Paul in prison. Right? I mean, that's where Paul's sitting there in prison. He's got a degree of freedom. He's preaching. He's writing. He's doing stuff. But in keeping with his expectation that he expressed when he wrote the letter from his imprisonment, Philippians, in chapter 1, verse 25 and 26, and chapter 2, verse 23 and 24, in keeping with the expectation that he expressed in those texts, it seems he was released from prison. Now, Acts ends with him in prison. But when Paul writes from prison, he has an expectation that he's going to be released. And so it seems that Paul is released from prison around AD 62, and there's a strong church tradition regarding that release. It's reflected in 1 Clement, which is a letter from the late 1st century, a non-canonical letter, obviously, but it's from a Christian writer in the late 1st century. It's reflected in the Muratorian Canon, which is around AD 180, and it's also reflected in Eusebius, who's an early 4th century church historian. So there is a strong church tradition about this release of Paul. Acts ends with him in that first Roman imprisonment, but it looks like Paul was released in keeping with the expectation that he had expressed in Philippians, and at some point, perhaps before his release, I hear that bell. I know that comforts you when I say that. At some point, you see, perhaps before his release, Paul sent Timothy to Ephesus. And upon his release, Paul may have gone west to Spain. As he had indicated, see, that was his intent when he wrote Romans. You see that in Romans 15, 23 to 28. So perhaps Paul went west to Spain when he was released. There are hints that he did so in church tradition. So when he's released, perhaps he went to Spain, but if he did so, it looks like he stayed in Spain a very short time, and then he made a missionary journey to Crete with Titus. Here's Crete. He made a missionary journey to the island of Crete with Titus, and he left Titus there to appoint elders in the various churches. You see that in Titus chapter 1, verse 5. And he thereafter wrote to Titus. And this is probably AD 63 or 64 that he then writes to Titus. Now, whether before or after he went to Crete with Titus, Paul went at some point to Macedonia. back into Macedonia, and it looks like Timothy, that Paul, remember Timothy had sent Paul to Ephesus, that Timothy came from Ephesus and met Paul while Paul was on his way to Macedonia. That's how it looks, see? And so he meets him there on his way, and this may be the tearful visit that Paul refers to in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 4. You see, if this was the first time, like if Paul had dispatched Timothy to Ephesus from prison, this would have been the first time that Timothy had seen Paul, his spiritual mentor, and, just tremendous relationship after Paul's release from prison. And it would have been very emotional, and then parting would have been even more so. Okay, so when Paul speaks of that tearful visit, this may have been it, where Paul's going into Macedonia, he's heading to Macedonia. Timothy comes from Ephesus to meet him, and then they part, and Paul tells him to remain in Ephesus, and that's this tearful exchange that they have. That's reflected in 2 Timothy. Paul tells him to stay in Ephesus to combat the false teaching that was threatening the church. And from what Timothy told him, the situation there was dire here in Ephesus. But what had Paul said? What had Paul prophesied in Acts chapter 20 when he called the elders from Ephesus there? That it's going to be a rough go here. So it fits perfectly with what had been going on. And so he has him there. It's tough. And then sometime after that meeting where Timothy had met Paul on his way to Macedonia, Paul wrote 1 Timothy, probably around 63 or 64. So this is when he writes 1 Timothy and writes to him there. Now, it seems that Paul was arrested again. This would have been as part of Emperor Nero's persecution of the church that was tied with his attempt to blame the Christians for the burning of Rome. In AD 64, a large portion of the city of Rome burned down. And many people thought that Nero was behind it because he wanted to redo the city. And so Nero didn't like the looks of that, so he decided to blame the Christians for doing it. And so this led to a rather intense persecution of Christians by Nero in Rome. And this is when, you have the Roman writers talking about Nero lighting his gardens with burning Christians. Of course, Nero was a nut. This guy's a psychopath. So he then turns on the Christians, and presumably this is when Paul was arrested, and it was during this imprisonment that Paul writes 2 Timothy. Because 2 Timothy is the last thing Paul writes, and this is right when Paul is on the brink of death. He says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. The time for my departure has come. But Paul says, by the way, I finished the race, baby. You see, I've been faithful through all this life, all these challenges, all these threats, all these beatings, shipwrecks, all those things. I have never let go of my commitment to serve the Lord Jesus Christ with all my heart. So now I'm ready to go. You see, that's how we are as Christians. You see, when we're faithful to the Lord Jesus Christ, say, okay, look, I don't want to die a painful death. You see, I'm a chicken. But I'll tell you, I know what's in store. See, I know what's in store. And I know that Christ is faithful. So now it's not long after that, by the way, after he writes 2 Timothy, probably AD 65, maybe AD 66. I heard that bell. According to church tradition, Paul was beheaded in Rome. Okay? So there we have from Paul's conversion, first missionary journey, second missionary journey, third missionary journey, rest of his life to his beheading. There you have it. Thanks for coming.